Rahim. Today, inshallah, we are going to complete chapter 5, and we will focus on the tax multiplier and the balanced budget multiplier. As you know, that in the last class, we discussed the government spending multiplier, and we took some exercises related to the government spending multiplier and the equilibrium income, right? And we said that the government spending multiplier is delta Y over delta G equals 1 over MPS or 1 minus MBC, right? So, suppose that the government decided to increase its spending by $100 million, right? And the MBC was 0.75. Calculate the change in the aggregate income or the aggregate output. So we have to use this formula, delta Y over delta G, positive 100 equals 1 over MBS. MBS in this case equals how much? 0.25. 0.25. So delta Y equals 100 times 1 over 100, 0.25. So equals 100 over 0.25 equals 400. So in this case, the aggregate income would increase by $400 million, right? Today, we will study the tax multiplier, which means, suppose that the government decided to decrease the taxes by $100 million. What are the main effects of this policy on the aggregate output? This is the question, right? So as we mentioned that if the government decided to increase its spending by $100 million, the aggregate output would increase by how much? $400 million. But what about the second side or the second phase, which is the taxes? You expect that if the government decided to decrease the taxes by $100 million, you expect the aggregate output would increase by the same amount, $400 million. But it is not. Because the effect of the government spending is larger than or greater than the effect of taxes. All the economic studies, researches, shows that the effect of government spending on the aggregate output is greater than the effect of taxes, right? So in general, the effect of change in the government spending on the aggregate output is larger than, or the multiplier, the government spending multiplier, the government spending multiplier is larger than the tax multiplier. But before that, let's see this or analyze the following. As you see, the reduction in taxes leads to increasing the aggregate output. So we have a positive relationship between, negative relationship between the taxes and the aggregate output. The decreasing in the taxes leads to increasing of the aggregate disposable income, which leads to increasing consumption by the MBC, the marginal propensity to consume. And then the spending or the aggregate expenditure would increase, the consumption spending, and then the employment would increase as well. The increasing of employment leads to increasing of aggregate output once again, and the increasing of income, then the consumption would increase once again, the aggregate, and so on. So we have a cycle, right? But the question is, how much is the value of the tax multiplier? The tax multiplier, we have a formula for the tax multiplier. Tax multiplier the tax multiplier or taxes multiplier is delta Y over delta G is delta T equals minus MBC over MPS. This is the formula of the tax multiplier. So let's do a comparison between the government spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. the government spending multiplier is delta Y over delta G equals 1 over MPS. The government or the tax multiplier is delta Y over delta T equals minus MBC over MPS, right? So let's use the following information to calculate the tax or the change in the aggregate output when tax decreased. So in this example, we assume that the government spending increased by $100 million and MBC equals 0.75, right? The change in aggregate output is $400 million, or we have an increasing in the aggregate output or aggregate income by $400 million. Suppose we have the same information and the government decided to decrease the taxes or tax collections by $100 million. So we have a decreasing in the taxes. Delta T is equals minus $100 million, and MBC is the same, 0.75. The question is, calculate the change in the aggregate output. In general, as you know that, the reduction of the taxes leads to what? To increasing the aggregate output, because the decreasing of the tax collections leads to stimulate the aggregate economy. Right? Or to stimulate the economy by increasing the aggregate output. So, as you see, delta Y over delta T equals minus MBC over MBS. So, delta Y over delta T is a decreasing in taxes, which means it should be minus 100 equals minus MBC minus 0.75 over MBS 0.25. So 0.25 times delta Y equals minus 100 times minus 0.75 equals positive 75, right? So delta Y equals positive 75 over 0.25 equals how much? 300. So what do you see? Let's do a comparison between the effect of the government spending and taxes. As I mentioned that the increasing of the government spending by $100 million leads to what? Leads to increasing of aggregate output by 400, right? If the government decreased the taxes by $100 million, the aggregate output increased by $300 million. So which has a larger or greater effect? The spending or the government spending or the taxes? The government spending, exactly. So sometimes you ask a question, suppose that the government spends $100 million, the aggregate output would increase. Or sometimes you ask, or you can ask that if the government spends $100 million and receive taxes by $100 million, sometimes you can say that there is no effects on the economy. صح؟ يعني أنت ممكن تسأل سؤال تيجي تقول والله الحكومة أنفقت 100 مليون وأخذت 100 مليون. There is no effect on the economy. Let's do this analysis, or let's analyze this case. Yani suppose that the government spends $100 million and received, or yes, collected taxes by $100 million. You will say that there is no effects on the economy. But we will see that we have there is an increase in the aggregate output, right? Multiplier. Exactly. But we will see it mathematically. So our assumption is, suppose that the government decided to increase its spending by $100 million, right? And at the same time, it withdrew or collected taxes by $100 million. يعني أعطيناه الناس $100 million spending وأخذنا taxes of $100 million. What are the main consequences and effects of this policy or procedure on the aggregate output? This is the question. So suppose that the government, as I mentioned, increase its spending by $100 million and the MBC is 0.75, right? This leads to increasing the aggregate output by how much? $400 million. At the same time, suppose that the government decided to increase the taxes by $100 million. So our assumption is we have increasing in spending by $100 million and received taxes by $100 million. What are the effects on the aggregate output? So as you see, the assumption is there is an increasing in the taxes by $100 million. Right? Increasing taxes by $100 million. At the same, we are talking about the same economy. At the same time, the government spends $100 million and received taxes or collected taxes by $100 million. So this is positive. So delta T equals positive $100 million in this case. صح? So delta Y over delta T, positive $100 million equals minus MBC 0.75 over 0.25. So it should be a decreasing in aggregate output. Delta Y 0.25 times delta Y equals positive 100 times minus 0.75. So what do you see? 0.25 delta Y equals minus 75. So delta Y in this case equals how much? Minus 75 over 0.25 equals minus 300. So what are the main effects or the main results of the change in the aggregate output? We will see. The final result would be what? The final, a change in the aggregate output, the final, a change and the aggregate output equals delta Y G, or the change in the aggregate output due to the increasing the government spending plus the change in Y due to the decreasing taxes or increasing the taxes. So it equals to what? Delta YG equals how much? Positive $400 million. Positive $400 million plus delta YT minus 300 minus $300 million. So delta Y, final delta Y equals 400 minus 300 equals $100 million. صح? So, in this case, as you see, when the government decided to spend $100 million and collect taxes by $100 million, the aggregate output would increase by $100 million. Right? تمام؟ مين عنده مشكلة أعيد له؟ أعيد؟ يا شباب؟ So, the final result is, or the theory, if the government spends $100 million and collected taxes or spent $100 million in the economy and collected $100 million, no, there is a change. There is an increase. The final result would be increasing the aggregate output by the same amount, by the same the same value of the government spending. صح؟ يعني احنا انفقنا مليون 100 مليون وسحبنا 100 مليون. النتيجة إنه الأجريجيت output would increase by $100 million. هي الأيديا. تمام؟ يا شباب؟ هلا بيجي واحد بيقول لك لا أنتم إحنا أنفقنا 100 مليون وسحبنا 100 مليون, there is no change. لا مش هيك الأمور. Is greater than, exactly, is the influence or the effect of the government spending is greater than the effects of the tax multiplier. Right? تمام? So let's go to take something else. This idea leads us to go to the So as you see, delta y over delta t equals minus MBC over MBS. To derive the delta y, or the change in y, equals delta t times minus MBC over MBS, right? So let's go to the balanced budget multiplier. The balanced budget multiplier. The balanced budget multiplier is, as we mentioned that, the government spending multiplier equals delta y over delta g, right? Which is 1 over MBS. And the tax multiplier equals delta y over delta t, which equals 1 over minus MBC over MBS. If the government spends $100 million and collected taxes by $100 million, in this case we have a balance in the budget, صح? Which called a balanced budget. لأنه أنفقنا 100 وأخذنا 100, there's a balanced budget. So the balanced budget multiplier is the summation of the government spending multiplier and the tax multiplier when they are equals. When we spend $100 million and receive or collected taxes by $100 million, the value of, we have a balance which called the balanced budget multiplier. تمام? So the balanced budget multiplier, A equals delta y over delta g when delta g equals delta t. Because here we have increasing in spending by $100 million and increasing the taxes by $100 million. صح? طب, let's do a deriving for the balanced budget multiplier and calculate how much is it's equal. So, as we mentioned that the balanced budget multiplier, equals the government spending multiplier plus the tax multiplier. The government spending multiplier plus the tax multiplier. When the government spending equals the change in the government spending equals the change in taxes. So the balanced budget multiplier equals what? This is the balanced budget multiplier, 1 over MBS. The tax multiplier is minus MBC over MBS. So the government spending multiplier is 1 over MBS plus minus MBC over MBS. صح? So this equals what? BBM, the balanced budget multiplier, equals 1 over MBS minus MBC over MBS. So عامل مشترك من تحت في المقام MBS 1 minus MBC. 1 minus MBC equals what? MBS. So MBS over MBS equals 1. So the balanced budget multiplier is always or must equals 1. Which means if the government increase its spending by $1 million, and collected taxes by $1 million, the aggregate output would increase by $1 million. صح؟ مظبوط؟ هان الidea شباب إنه if the government increased its spending by $1 million and collected taxes by $1 million, the aggregate output would increase by $1 million. قد حنشوف exercises. تمام؟ لا مطلوب منك. So as you see, let's go to this example. Okay. Suppose the equilibrium Y was $900 million. And suppose the government spending increased by 200 and the government taxes increased by $200 billion at the same time. What will occur to the equilibrium Y? So the question is, okay, let's come back here. It's related to this exercise. As you see, this is Y, taxes, YD, CIG, and the equilibrium. We derive the equilibrium here, which is at point 1 or at Y equals 1100. هذا تعلمناه بالمحاضرة السابقة مظبوط؟ طيب. Now the question is, suppose that the equilibrium Y was $900 million and suppose the government spending increased, delta G equals how much? Increased by how much? $200 million. At the same time, the taxes increased, delta T equals $200 million. In this example, how much is the MBC? The MBC in this case equals how much? We have to derive the MBC. MBC delta C over delta Y. 400 minus 250 قديش هذا؟ 150 over 200 150 over 200 75% مظبوط؟ 0.75. So in this case, when MBC equals 0.75, calculate the change in the aggregate output. This is the question. So the question is, we have an increasing in the government spending by 200, increasing the taxes by 200. When MBC equals 0.75, how much is that change in Y? Exactly, 200, but we have to use the formula to calculate it. So we have to calculate the government spending multiplier and then the change and the effect of a change in the government spending and the change of Y as a result of a change in the taxes. And finally, we'll see the aggregate change, or the final change in the aggregate output. So, in the first case, delta Y over delta G equals 1 over MBS. So, delta Y over delta G increasing by $200 million, positive $200 million, equals 1 over MBS 0.25. So, delta Y equals 200 times 1 positive 200 over 0.25 equals positive $800 million. This is what? The change in the aggregate output due to the change in the government spending, صح? طيب, what about the effect of taxes on the aggregate output? This is the question. So delta Y over delta T equals minus MBC over MBS. So delta Y over the delta taxes, we have increasing in taxes, so it should be positive. Over positive 200 equals minus 0.75 over 0.25. So 0.25 delta Y equals the times 200, positive 200 times minus 0.75, how much? Positive minus 150. So delta Y equals minus 150 over 0.25. How much? 150 في 4 minus 600. So the final result would be, or the final change in Y, delta Y or final delta Y equals delta YG, or the change in Y as a result of the government spending, the change in the government spending, plus delta YT. So the final delta Y equals delta YG positive 200, 800, plus minus 600 equals positive 200. This means what? When the government, or if the government increase its spending by $200 million and increase the taxes by $200 million, the aggregate output would increase by $200 million. Right? تمام? وهذا في البالانس budget multiplier. So let's go to the exercises to be clear. Okay, so let's go to this example. As you see, we have information or data about an economy. So let's go to discuss these data and what are the questions. As you see, we have Y. This is the aggregate income, taxes, consumption, saving, I, G. The question is, number one, derive and calculate the equilibrium level of income. The equilibrium level of income when Y equals C plus I plus G. The equilibrium occurs when Y equals the aggregate expenditure, which is C plus I plus G, right? So Y equals C equals 100 plus 0.9 YD. It's given here. As you see, it's the consumption function. So a plus I, the planned investment, equals how much? 130. A plus the government spending, $200 million. So Y equals 100 plus 130 plus 200 equals how much? 300, 430 plus 0.9 times YD. YD is Y minus T. Y minus T, the taxes equals $100 billion. So Y equals 430 plus 0.9 times Y, 9Y. Plus 0.9 times minus 100 minus 90. صح? So Y equals 400 minus 90 equals how much? 340 plus 0.9 Y. Shifting, so 1Y minus 0.9 Y equals 340. So 0.1 Y equals 340. So Y equals 3,400. This is the equilibrium level of income. تمام؟ طيب. Yes. YD? Which one? YD equals Y minus T. Right? So here substitution. YD equals Y minus T. Right? طيب. Calculate the consumption in this case. Direct substitution. Y or C equals 100 plus 0.9 YD. So C equals 100 plus 0.9 for Y minus T. Or C equals 100 plus 0.9 times Y, 3,400, right? 3,400 minus taxes, how much? 100. So C equals 100 plus 0.9 times 3,300. صح؟ قديش هذا بيطلع؟ 100 زائد شوف الآلة على السريع هيك شباب. So C equals 3,000 0.70. That's it. Right? طيب. Now calculate the government spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. So the question is, calculate the government spending multiplier and okay. So the question is, calculate the tax or the government spending multiplier. The government spending multiplier equals what? 1 over MBS. That's it. So equals 1 over MPS. صح? So which equals 1 over MPS equals how much in this case? No, this is MBC. MBC is 0.9. Exactly. So MBC is 0.1 because it equals 1 minus MBC. And MBC in this case, as you know, equals 0.9. So it equals 10. What about the tax multiplier? The tax multiplier equals minus MBC over MBS equals minus MBC minus 0.9 over 0.1 equals how much? Minus 9. صح؟ مظبوط؟ طيب the balance budget multiplier equals how much? 1. Exactly. The balance budget multiplier equals the government spending multiplier plus the tax multiplier, which equals the government spending multiplier is 10 plus minus 9 equals 1. It's always equals 1. Right? طيب. Now suppose that the government spending increased by $300 million and the taxes خلينا ناخد الهاي امسح. So the question is, suppose that the government spending increased by $300 million and the taxes increased by $300 million as well. Calculate the change or the final change in the equilibrium output. So امسح هذا الجزء. Okay. So the question is, suppose that the government spending G increased, delta G increased by $300 million. So, and the taxes delta T increased by $300 million or $200 million. خلينا نقول هيك $200 million. What are the main effects of this policy on the aggregate output? We have to use the government spending multiplier and the tax multiplier and calculate the change in or the final result on the aggregate output. صح? So, in the first case, delta Y, or when we use the government spending multiplier, delta Y over delta G equals 1 over MBS. So delta Y over delta G, we have a change in the government spending by $300 million. Positive 300 equals 1 over MBS 0.1. Right? So delta Y over, or delta Y equals, or 0.1, delta Y equals positive 300 times 1. 300, positive 300. So delta Y equals $3,000 million positive. صح? What about the effective tax in this case? We have an increasing in the taxes by $200 million. So delta Y over delta T equals minus MBC over MBS. صح? So delta Y over positive 200, because we have increasing in taxes. If we have increasing in taxes should be positive, a decreasing in taxes should be negative, right? Or minus. So equals minus 0.9 over positive 1. So 0.1 delta Y equals positive 200 times minus 0.9. So delta Y equals, how much is this? Minus 180 over 0.1. So delta Y equals minus 1,800. So calculate the final change in the aggregate output. قديش الفاينل change? So the final change delta Y final equals delta YG plus delta YT, which equals 3,000 minus 1,800 equals how much? 1,200. positive. So the final result would be an increasing in the aggregate output. تمام؟ طيب. Let's go to another exercise. Okay, as you see in this exercise, for example, if the government spending multiplier is 2, and the government purchases increased by 200 billion, the output will increase by how much? This is the question. So, أمسح هذا. Okay. So the question is, if the government spending multiplier equals the government spending multiplier equals 2, right? And the government purchases increased by $200 million. The question is, the aggregate output would increase by how much? So we have delta G equals positive 200, right? So delta Y over delta G equals the multiplier, the government spending multiplier. So the government's delta Y over positive 200 equals the government spending multiplier, which is 2. So delta Y equals positive 200 times 200 equals positive 400. So in this case, the output will increase by $400 million, right? Yes. حاضر. As you see, the government spending multiplier is given equals 2, and the assumption is that the government spending increased by $200 million. The question is, calculate the change in the aggregate output. The formula is the government spending multiplier equals delta Y over delta G, right? So the government spending multiplier equals 2, and delta Y over delta G positive 200. So delta Y equals positive 400. That's it. Yes, Rabbi. Exactly. We can use whether delta Y or over delta G or 1 over MBS. Yes. طيب. Let's go to decrease. So let's go to this example. As you see, if the government spending multiplier equals 5 and the government spending decreased by $200 billion, the output will decrease or increase by how much? This is the question. So the same idea, when the government spending multiplier equals 5 and the government spending decreased, delta G equals minus how much? 200. The question is, calculate the change and the aggregate output. And is it decreasing or increasing there? So delta Y over delta G equals, or the government spending multiplier equals delta Y over delta G. The government 5 equals delta Y over delta G minus 200. So delta Y equals decreasing by $1,000 million or billion dollars, right? So let's go to this figure. As you see, we have the aggregate output function, right? And the aggregate expenditure function, which is C plus I plus G. Number one, derive the aggregate expenditure function. The aggregate expenditure function. Who can derive it? The aggregate expenditure function in this case equals 300 A plus the MBC times Y. صح? So the aggregate expenditure function equals 300, the intercept, plus the MBC times Y. MBC equals this distance over this distance. 200 over 500 equals 40, right? صح? Sorry? Yes, exactly. So the MBC in this case equals 500 minus 300 over 500 minus 0. 200 over 500 equals 0.40. So the aggregate expenditure function equals how much? 300 plus 0.4y. How much is the government spending multiplier and the tax multiplier? Let's derive or calculate the tax multiplier. Tax multiplier equals 1 minus MBC over MBS, right? Which is minus 0.40 over 0.60 equals how much? الآلة بتطلع الرقم تبعنا 0 point minus. Yes. طيب suppose that the government decided to decrease its spending by $200 million and increase the taxes by $300 million. What are the main effects and consequences of this policy or procedure on the aggregate equilibrium output? This is the question. So the question is, suppose that the government decided to increase its spending by $200 million. And at the same time, it decided to decrease the taxes by $300 million. Calculate the new equilibrium aggregate output. Main effects and consequences of this policy on the aggregate output. As we mentioned that we have to calculate the aggregate output by the change in the aggregate output as a result or due to the change in the government spending and then the taxes, and we will then we have to calculate the change, the final change. So delta y over delta g equals 1 over MBC. This is what? We are using the government spending multiplier. So delta y over delta g positive 200 equals 1 over MBC equals how much? Sorry, MBS, exactly. 0.6. Right? So delta y equals 200 times 1, 200 over 0.6 positive equals how much? على الآلة سريعا هيك شباب. So it should be positive. Okay, this is what? The change in the aggregate output due to the change in the government spending. Let's go to calculate the change in the aggregate output due to the change in the taxes. As we mentioned that we have a decreasing in taxes by $300 billion or $1 million. So delta y over delta t equals minus MBC over MBS. So delta y over, we have a decreasing in taxes by $300 billion, which is minus 300 equals minus MBC 0.4 over 0.6. So 0.6 delta y dy equals minus 300 times minus 0.4. How much is it? 0.6 delta y equals 100 positive 120. So delta y equals positive 120 over positive 0.6 equals $200 million positive. So what are the main results or the main effect? Yes, exactly. So the final delta y equals delta yg plus delta yt, which equals 333 plus 200, which equals 533. That's a change in the aggregate output. So let's come back to the figure here. Where is the new equilibrium aggregate income or aggregate output? As we mentioned, the new equilibrium here or the old equilibrium was at 500. Exactly. Now we have to add 533, right? So it should be here 1033. This is the new equilibrium. This is the aggregate expenditure, the new equilibrium point. صح؟ مظبوط؟ صعب الأمور ولا؟ يعطيكم العافية. يعطيكم